Hi everyone, this is an illustration of a basic enemy character that will be appearing in the retro pixel art video game called Metro Siege that we're working on over at Bitbeam Canon. The first step after coming up with a general description of the character was to gather reference images for the fashion and then eventually for the pose once I knew I was going to do an illustration. But before the illustration came, I actually designed the character in pixel art to make sure that I was using colors and contrast and things like that that would work well within the actual game's technical limitations. Another critical aspect of character design for retro pixel art games is, since the pixels that make your character are quite large relative to the character, you have to keep that in mind when designing the character. You don't want to add a lot of small details that aren't going to translate well or going to disappear or just end up looking like a bunch of single pixel sort of confetti throughout your character. You want to work in big shapes of contrasting value and color for your overall design and rely heavily on just the overall silhouette of the character. And as you saw at the beginning, you just start by working out the general pose and proportions. There's no sense in getting into any fine details or fashion or the clothes or hair of the character until you have a really solid sort of foundation to build upon of the human form, because you can really run into problems if you just start trying to draw details right away built on top of either a non-existing frame or a frame that is not going to be especially accurate because you don't have that underlying foundation of proper proportion and anatomy. You might have also noticed that I had started with a drafting pencil, which holds a very thick lead that you actually have to sharpen. The nice thing about that being you can actually intentionally not sharpen it too much, so you have a softer, rounder tip that's easier to sketch in bolder forms very quickly. There's no risk of kind of digging grooves into your illustration board or paper. It makes it very quick to work and very easy to erase and to work very lightly with the graphite. And then once everything was well established and I was working on the finer details, then I switched to a 0.7 sized mechanical pencil so that I could get into the finer lines. And now you could see here, once I'm happy with all the line work in pencil, to whatever degree detail I'm confident I can translate over to ink, I just move over to standard permanent ink black marker pens. And depending on many things like the type of paper or illustration board you're working on, the brand of liner pens, and even the humidity of the day, the ink is going to take a little more or less time to fully dry on the illustration board. So be very careful and mindful not to sort of rub your hand over or across, or kind of, if you're brushing off eraser marks, make sure you don't smudge the ink while you're inking. And that can be especially challenging for left-handed people like myself, where very often your palm of your hand is resting on what you're drawing. So be mindful of that. You can use things as a sort of bridge to rest your hand on, or even just put a sheet of paper while you're drawing, either in pencil or ink, between your palm and the paper to help protect from smudging and getting a bunch of graphite or ink on your palm that you can then kind of accidentally track over the rest of the drawing. I like to save inking the face and other really fine and important details for last to sort of loosen up and make sure I'm confident with my strokes when I'm inking before I get into those critical areas, because with real media there's no undo key and your illustration is going to look pretty ugly. If you're going to give the final illustration to someone, then you want it to look as nice as possible and you don't want things like white out on the illustration board. Whereas if you were just doing illustrative work for things like a comic book, then it wouldn't be a big deal to use something like whiteout to make a correction, because then it's all going to be scanned and printed later and no one's ever going to see the whiteout in the finished product. So as you can see, I'm moving on to the face, but I'm still not going to be done once the face and hair are done at this stage. I always start by inking the thinner lines and the major details, And then once all of that is done, I start looking for lines that I can thicken. Varied line width really makes your drawing much nicer and have a more three-dimensional appearance even before you go into actual shading and coloring. And in general, as a rule, you just want to add more thickness to your lines on the undersides and things that are away from the light source. And traditionally you have a light source from the upper left, so lower right sides of things would have thicker lines, and especially where you have one thing overlapping another in three-dimensional space, you want thicker lines to help separate that thing off of the things that are behind it. I then waited a good half hour or hour for the ink to be totally dry before I erase over the entire illustration and then photocopied it. If you're looking for a much lower cost but still very good alternative to coloring with alcohol-based art markers, then I highly recommend you check out this video I made previously, specifically about the coloring methods I use, where I actually use pigment-based, which are more permanent, printer inks. In the video I show the techniques I use, the materials I use, and how I mix the colors in dropper bottles. And once those colors are pre-mixed, my sort of default palette, I can then very easily mix any of the pre-made colors I've made with each other to literally create an infinite variety, any color I need. It's really nice to never worry again about markers drying up, about not having the marker color you need for a given illustration. I can always mix any color I need on the fly very quickly, either into another dropper bottle if I know I'm going to be using that color a lot, or I can just mix directly onto the palette, like one drop of one color and one drop of another of my pre-made colors, and it's just a very effective, very freeing way to not only have a much smaller budget for your coloring required, but also to just never have to worry about those limitations that come with coloring with markers. Another great benefit to brushing on your colors that I don't really take advantage of for this particular illustration is, depending on the brush and the brush strokes or method you're using to applying the colors, you can add all kinds of really cool textures to your illustration very, very easily. Things like dry brushing, and there's just so many different ways. You can use a specialty brush that is really good for creating a bunch of fine lines right near each other, which can be really handy for things like hair and fur. There's just the possibilities are endless, whereas with a marker it's much more limited, or you have to draw every little line at a time. That all aside, there are definitely some trade-offs to using printer inks in pre-mixed bottles. It's definitely a bit less portable. It's a lot easier to just carry a marker set on the go. Also, markers you can even use on typing paper, and because it's alcohol-based, it doesn't really damage the paper very much. Whereas with these printer inks, you're using water as a base and to thin the colors down, so you really need to be working on a better quality illustration board like Bristol board that can take some abuse, and it's a really good idea. You're typically going to be coloring in layers from lightest to darkest, and you're going to want to wait a few minutes between each layer to let the paper dry and kind of recover its strength. If you keep scrubbing in more and more wet layers of color, you're going to really start breaking apart the kind of structural integrity of the paper, which can lead to problems or just, unsightly side effects to just getting the paper too wet too quickly. As I mentioned, much like with markers, because these colors go on transparently, you want to work from lightest color to dark. You have to plan ahead if you're going to leave white highlights and just never paint those colors on where you want the white to be there eventually. You could of course use like an opaque white marker or even white paint to add back in highlights if you really need to, but to avoid that necessity or look, you can plan ahead and leave white the areas you want to stay white. And after that, in general, you just work from lightest to darkest, you let it dry between each layer, and you stay mindful of the light source, where usually the lightest part of what you're shading in is going to be in the kind of left and center and upper regions, and then the shadows are going to be in the lower right But in the case of things that are very dark or nearly black, like these pants, it's good to use a different lighting method where you're actually relying on reflected light and edge light to kind of give you the details and hit the edges of things like wrinkles and the edges of the form, and then in general fill in the major central mass of the form with the darkest color. So that's why I seem to be kind of breaking the rules with those pants as far as the light source. But it's really just especially if you're coloring or shading something that looks like it should be very dark, or dark leather pants or something more shiny, then you switch your lighting style. So you're not just dealing with contrast in colors, contrast in values, you're also dealing with differences in how different things reflect light. And I saved the skin for last because it's the most light and kind of delicate coloring required. And here is the finished product. So there is the inked version and the colored version. And I hope this was entertaining and hopefully a little educational. Here's a close-up so you can see the detail work of the line art. And then we're going to do the same thing and show you the finished colored work. So thanks very much for watching.